So in addition to being a peer myself, for a number of years now, I've been working as a facilitator with groups of peer specialists, including some on our own folks, recovery coaches, and a whole variety of staff across a whole bunch of service settings. And for years, I trained on trauma-informed peer support. Maybe some of you are familiar with that training, and on trauma-informed approaches more generally. And I saw how eye-opening it was for people to understand and learn about the impact of trauma. But I also saw the limitations of those approaches, that trauma-informed is an important step, but in and of itself is not enough. And so in these trainings that I did with folks over and over again, I heard common themes. I heard a lot about burnout. I heard about staff turnover, right, being a huge issue, and a lot of traumatizing work situations, right, that awareness of trauma alone could not resolve. And I also noticed when I was working with folks on implementation that there was a lot of struggle and challenge in moving from being trauma informed to being truly trauma responsive, right? And that is a task that is ongoing. So with this framework that I'm about to share with you, it's really helping to build on the knowledge about trauma in the hopes of creating truly trauma responsive work environments that can prevent burnout. And I'll just say that this whole framework was developed by Vikki Reynolds, and I'm going to drop a link here into the chat, who is an incredible social justice oriented social worker out of Vancouver, British Columbia. And Vikki always says that this training was also heavily informed and driven by the peers that she works with. So in particular, this is in the front lines of the opioid epidemic, right? But all of these learnings actually can be applied to this, whatever phase of the pandemic that we're in now as well. So without further ado, let's get right into it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, here we go. So I want to start briefly with an opening reflection. And in the busy crush of our lives and days, sometimes it's important to reconnect with what is at the heart of your work. Why are you here, right? Is it connection? Is it transformation? Is it healing, liberation? Feel free to drop into the chat. What is at the heart of your work? So for me, it's transformation is a big one, both on the personal level, the organizational level, as well as systems and society. I can't separate out any of those things, right? And it's really about creating a more just and caring and interdependent world. So I'm just gonna see if I can. So I see here connection, Sharon saying empowerment, advocacy, helping others, serving, yes, absolutely. Yeah, so just tapping into really that heart at the center of your work, educating, service, being a change agent, advocacy, connection, change on a large level, helping others. Yeah, I love it. I love the spirit of what brings us here together, the spirit behind all of the work of On Our Own and its networks. So thank you for taking a bit of that time. And so as I'm talking today, and this is an invitation for the whole conference, right? Thinking about how does this matter in the environment where I work, right? And thinking about what is the difference that I can make to help my organization and systems and society, right? To shift to a more trauma responsive, resilience inducing world. Who is in solidarity with me, whether it's at my organization, outside of my organization, to make these changes? And noticing what is it that you're already doing well, right? We want to be strengths-based in everything that we do, right? That's at the center of peer values. And what are we already doing, and what's required that we haven't gotten to, right? So what are some possible next action steps? And so I really want to just start us off. This is a a framework very much based in social justice, right? And so what you see here is a map of all the indigenous nations that now make up what is called Maryland, right? And my source from this is, if you're curious about the indigenous lands that you are on, it's called nativeland.ca. So if you are not aware, you can find out more. And so I want to start with a land acknowledgement. Maybe some of you are familiar with this, but I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Manahoac people, and I'm in Reston, Virginia. And I pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. And this is also an invitation for you in your particular location. I saw people from all over the state to acknowledge the indigenous people of the land that you reside on, paying respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. And it's really important to note that this is not a new thing, the land acknowledgement. It's a traditional custom that dates back centuries for many Native communities and nations. And for non-Indigenous communities, land acknowledgement is such a powerful way of showing respect for and honoring the Indigenous people of the land on which we work and live. It's a way to resist the erasure of Indigenous histories and work towards honoring and inviting the truth. And we can't separate the grief and the loss of this pandemic time from everything that came before, right? Including the effects of colonization, of racialized violence that continue to echo in this country. And so we're gonna talk about that as a way of understanding burnout from a social justice perspective. And so I also talk about this as an anti-perfection project, right? So it means that sometimes we're not always going to get it right? We may respond to oppressive or unjust situations, and then we're going to reflect and learn something and maybe have better actions. We're going to apologize or make a repair if necessary. We're not always going to get it right. And so if we come from this anti-perfection approach when it comes to learning and growing and working for social justice, we're not going to get paralyzed, right? And be in inaction. And what do I mean by inviting discomfort, right? That's about inviting the discomfort that's needed to address issues of power and injustice and to shift towards justice doing. So I think that that's a really, really important thing to remember in this process of learning and unlearning. It can be messy, right? So I think understanding the context of people's lives really matters. And when I do this full day, 2-day training actually on this topic, we really go deep into looking at the social justice context. But that's really what it means to resist burnout from a decolonizing, right, and trying to do justice perspective. And so when we talk about justice doing, right, because this is a framework about resisting burnout through justice doing. And that means that we are doing dignity with people, right? And that's so central to peer work, right? Witnessing the resistance of people to abuses of power, right? Whether those be structural or interpersonal. We also want to resist accommodating suffering others to oppressive lives, right? And that's the key to burnout, right? If you think your job is to teach people how to breathe and ground through oppression, that's not going to work out so well. Breathing and grounding is great, but we're not here to just patch people up and throw them back out into hell, right? And when I think of this, I think about Indigenous women who've experienced sexual violence, right? We're also really working to collectively transform culture at our organizations and to build a more just society. So that's really what's behind this idea of doing dignity with people and witnessing resistance and trying to transform the social context. So I just need to lay out a bit about trauma, right? I know so many of you are very versed in trauma, but a way of understanding this so that we can have a conversation about things like vicarious trauma before we can talk about burnout and before we can talk about how to resist it. So when we talk about trauma, if we just look at it in the sort of broadest possible way, that is about being overwhelmed, right? But the problem with the language of trauma is that it's this very medicalized language, right? It gives people a psychological diagnosis, and it talks about things as if it actually happens in the people's brains. And of course, we know from neuroscience, trauma does land in the brain, it lands in the body. That's absolutely undeniable. But trauma doesn't happen in the brain, right? Trauma happens in the real world, right? In situations of abuse, of power, injustice, oppression. So if you think about trauma, let's just talk about it from the psychological perspective. First, we agree that to be traumatized is to be overwhelmed, right? And that there's three general kinds of events that lead to trauma, right? Three kinds of behaviors. And that's abuse, neglect, and ambient trauma. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these. So abuse, these are the things we know from the adverse childhood experiences study, right? It's the things that happen that ought not to happen to people. Kids being physically, sexually, emotionally abused, people of all ages experiencing violence and harm, right? That's abuse. And neglect is the things that should have happened but didn't happen, right? So neglect is things like not having enough food, being starved, babies sleeping in their cribs and crying and nobody coming in, right? To change their diaper, that kind of thing is neglect. And so trauma, from a psychological perspective, it's looking at the symptoms that people have, right? If you've developed X, Y, and Z symptoms, then you have a diagnosis of trauma. And so when we talk about the symptoms, we're looking at intrusion, hyperarousal, avoidance, and numbing, right? So if we look at something like post-traumatic stress disorder, if someone's been sexually assaulted or raped, 6 months after that event in which they thought they were going to die and they were totally helpless, if they still have these kinds of symptoms, whether it's intrusion, hyperarousal, avoidance, and numbing, then they're considered to have post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And so what do we mean by symptoms? Symptoms are just behaviors, right? But if you look at intrusion, hyperarousal, avoidance, and numbing, these are ways that people respond to the harms that have happened to them. So if we look, for example, in the case of sexualized assault, intrusion, it's like this boundary you set with yourself, right? I'm not going to think about this, right? That crosses right over into your brain. And you can tell yourself, I'm not going to think about it, but it just keeps playing back, back like a video, like a movie in your mind. Now, hyperarousal is when your response to harm is to kind of blow yourself up, right? And get really big. You're trying to fight back all the time. That's hyperarousal. And, as we know, that's the kind of thing that does get people into trouble, right? In systems and service settings, that kind of hyperaroused behavior. So avoidance and numbing, this is the stuff that we think of with dissociation, right? When you actually separate from your body. If you've ever had these experiences where you're sort of terrified and you're watching yourself from above, or it's almost as if you're having an out-of-body experience, that's dissociation, right? So avoidance and numbing, we can really look at these as things that people do to try to get themselves away from an experience, right? And with hyperarousal, there's these ideas that we have that unfortunately are very damaging, but this idea that people become homeless because they are mentally ill, addicted, traumatized, but that's actually not true, right? You actually become homeless because there's not enough housing, right? And then if after 6 months, depending on how you respond to harm, you develop intrusion, hyperarousal, or avoidance and numbing, then you're going to develop some kind of mental illness, trauma, and addiction just by being homeless, right? So trauma, we're thinking about it as just being overwhelmed, right? Where you can't function in terms of all of the domains of life tasks, right? Meaning emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, socially, between people, right? And your relationship to the planet. You're disconnected, right? One of the things I would say is that the problem is disconnection, and the answer is always connection, right? We know this from peer work. So the concern with using trauma language is that it tends to talk about people as if they are mentally ill, right? When we're talking, in the example I just used, we're talking about people who are unhoused, right? So see the distinction there? And then the other thing I want to talk about is the problem in terms of what we understand as abuse and what we understand as neglect. right? Usually psychology is pretty much only interested in the nuclear family, right? It's a very Western European construct. So we talk about neglectful families, we talk about abusive parents, but a lot of people have great parents. They're just poor, right? So if you and your family are living in a car because of poverty, you're going to get possibly apprehended because of neglect. And it's going to say on paper that you come from a neglectful family, but your parents are not neglectful. They're just poor. They're unhoused, right? That is the problem. That's really why it's so important to lay out the politics of where we are with, for example, the housing crisis in this country. You have to have that analysis, or people can kind of slip into this idea that folks are broken and that they're responsible for their own harms, right? We see that a lot in systems. So then also, if you look at abuse, I think racism is abuse, right? There's a lot of kids who have incredible parents, right? But they are living with hyperarousal. They're waiting to be attacked all the time. They're ready to fight all the time, right? The experience of being a person of color in every store you walk into, you're followed around every time you walk down the street, right? Or white women are clutching their purses, or that kind of abuse doesn't make it feel safe to be in the world, to walk in the world, right? And then seeing people of color targeted by criminalization, police violence, right? That's actually abuse. And so a big critique of the adverse childhood experiences work is that it didn't capture this kind of trauma, right? And that's where we're getting into the ambient trauma, right? So thinking about even someone who has undocumented parents, right? Being afraid of ICE showing up, at the door all the time, right? That's the stuff of ambient trauma. And this actually comes from the work of Alan Shore, right? If you think of ambient music as the white noise music, right? It doesn't have much of a melody, but it fills the space, right? That's what we're in right now is this ambient trauma, with this kind of transitional phase we're in with the pandemic, the uncertainty, what's going on with the opioid epidemic, the ongoing echoes of racial injustice in this country. That's all the stuff of ambient trauma that doesn't get captured, right, in that adverse childhood experiences framework. And that so often, like, families can be blamed for all of the social norms and the injustices I just discussed, right? And it locates the harm within that person or within that family. And so now we have these understandings about neuroplasticity in the brain and neuroscience, which is all really useful, but it's limiting. Because if we start to only locate the problem as if it's in the brain, that's not completely accurate. The problem's in the world, right? The problem is not the person. The problem is the world as it is. So I hope that was kind of helpful in terms of laying the groundwork in terms of where we're going. So after this idea, right, that all of the folks coming in for services, are traumatized, and certainly the high percentage of people using services have experienced trauma. I'm not denying that. But now we have this idea of vicarious trauma, right? And so what are we talking about with vicarious trauma, caregiver trauma? I mean, I'll give you my best example if you just think of any of the James Bond movies, right? Daniel Craig, picture any of them, the one where he's on the motorcycle and there's a car chase or a foot race that goes on for 8 minutes, and they're jumping through windows and jumping over roofs, and then James Bond kind of just straightens up his shirt and lands in the train, and then it's the next scene. And so I'm watching that, and I don't know about you, but I'm like blown away. I'm literally on the edge of my seat during all of that. And by the end, I'm exhausted. But all I've been doing is sitting in my seat eating popcorn, right? Nothing actually happened to me. So that's kind of the idea behind vicarious trauma, is that I witnessed something and then I have an experience as if it happened to me. And there's definitely a lot of neurological psychology, neuroscience behind this. We know there's mirror neurons in our brain that cause us to feel like something actually happened to us when it never did, right? And that's the stuff of vicarious trauma. And just to give you a bit of background, because I just think it's so interesting to look at the history of where things come from, vicarious trauma actually comes from Judith Herman, who's a psychiatrist that maybe some of you have heard of. And she went with a whole team of medical doctors, nurses, a whole bunch of folks, nutritionists, to a refugee camp to work. So all of these workers are there in the refugee camp, and you can only imagine the amount of pain and suffering and trauma in that refugee camp. And within a few weeks, guess what's happening, right? They're having all of these symptoms. The psychiatrists are having nightmares. They're having visions they can't get rid of. They're having hyperarousal where they're getting into arguments and looking to defend themselves. They're having all of these symptoms of trauma, but they're very confused about this because they're like, hey, we're the helpers, we're the well and the good, we're the doctors and the psychologists and the psychiatrists, and these are the broken, traumatized people, right, in this refugee camp. So they came up with this hypothesis, right, which I do not agree with, but it's the idea that clients infect us with their hopelessness, right? And that doesn't make sense to peer workers or to any kind of frontline workers ever, right? It's not, I hear this over and over again from peers, it's not the clients that are causing harm to us, right? There is harm that happens in this work, but it's not caused by the clients infecting us with their hopelessness. And so secondary traumatic stress, empathic stress disorders, these are just other ways to understand that. And compassion fatigue. Now, this is an interesting one. It's a little bit of my pet peeve, right? Compassion is very different than sympathy, right? Sympathy is when you feel sorry for someone, and compassion says, I have also experienced things, right? It's at the heart of the peer experience. Although you don't have to be a peer to have compassion, of course, but it's this idea that I'm in this with you, right? And I have also had my own lived experience. And I think compassion is not really something that can be taught. And the problem, though, is that people are often drawn to this work in the helping professions for sympathy reasons, right? And sympathy will only cause harm, I think, in this work, because what's really required is compassion. And it's tough work because you have to reveal yourself and you have to do your own work, right? That's compassion. So compassion fatigue is this idea, it's just about 30 years old, right? That you have a certain amount of compassion, and after you spend it, you're out, right? And now you're selling shoes because you don't have any more compassion. You've fatigued your compassion, right? And the Dalai Lama, actually, there's so many wisdom teachings from Tibetan cultures and other cultures about compassion. So the Dalai Lama, what he teaches about compassion actually is the opposite of this compassion fatigue idea, that compassion is a generative force, right? It's like love. The more you do compassion, the more you create compassion, you can't use it up, right? That's a very sort of capitalist notion, right? That it's very individual and it's based on kind of commodifying human experience. You can't quantify compassion, but you can't waste it or throw it away or run out of it. So I think we really need to interrogate this idea of compassion fatigue. So these are just some of the ideas, that we're being handed about the ways that we're being harmed in the work. And I find them problematic, right? Because they structure workers as having the problem. And so when we look at burnout, it's this language that is just sort of deprofessionalized vicarious trauma, you could say, or empathic stress disorder, or all of these things. And I think what they're trying to figure out, and it's very well intentioned, is how do we help workers and how do we keep workers alive in the work? This is really, really important stuff. I am not denying that, but we don't explain it by blaming the clients for hurting us, because that's actually not what's happening. So my concern with people saying, they're burned out or other workers are burned out, is that it's all very kind of individually structured, right? Around this idea that you personally need to keep yourself well for the work. And you can't do that by yourself, right? That's something that we're going to talk about, right? We can't do this alone. We're meant to do this work together. So the way we talk about burnout is in a very sort of individualistic way, but it's also kind of this language, again, that's really framed around mental illness and disorder and deficit, right? And then the other thing is when you talk about burnout or vicarious trauma or any of these things, the answer is always self-care, right? How are you taking care of yourself? And it's important, and we're going to talk about why it's important. But in some ways, it's actually the wrong question. And this was one of the most eye-opening things I discovered when I started learning from Vikki and her team. Because when you question that around self-care and how's your self-care and how much are you doing, you've already decided that workers are personally responsible for all of the harms that are happening in this work. So I actually want to transition to a video where we're gonna watch Vikki talking about what self-care can do and what it can't. But I want to make sure I have my sound settings right really quick before I do that, so that you can hear this. All right, super.
Hi, I'm Vikki Reynolds. I'm going to talk about some ideas that I've got around resisting burnout. Burnout is often talked about as if it's a very individual problem of workers, as if workers are missing some kind of containment or some resiliency or some like quantity inside of them. It's constructed very much as like a failure of workers when they are not able to continue in work. And that's not the way that I see it at all, especially if we look at the opiate epidemic or the poisonings or political killings, however you understand that. For me, people are working in structures that are horrid, but that are very much within a context of social injustice. And we don't have the resources we need to deliver to people. That's what's hurting people. So, I've supervised people at the Rape Crisis Center, people working with survivors of torture, people working with sex workers, and people working in housing in the downtown East Side. And nobody tells me that the reason that they need to leave the work or the harms that they're suffering from the work is because of the pain they're witnessing in others. Most folks tell me it's because we're not given the resources to do the work that we need to do. So, if you see the problem as responding to suffering others, that these are actually issues of social injustice, then the fact that we have this massive amount of need of suffering people and limited resources, that stops us from being able to provide like ethical care. That seems to me, that makes sense that that's actually what's going on for people. So the way that I think about it is, if you believe that what you are doing is ethical, even if it's heartbreaking and you're responding to human suffering, you can have sustainability. And by sustainability, I mean something so much more than just not burning out. No one tells me as a clinical supervisor that their goal in this work across time is to not burn out in the work, right? We want so much more than that. So sustainability is a much bigger thing than that. It's about having a spirited presence with people and being able to have that human connection with folks, right? But it's also about our own transformations. Being open to the fact that we are also going to be changed for this work across time. So, sustainability is about being able to be of use to people across time. This is so much more than just not burning out. And if we believe that what we're doing is ethical, no matter how hard it is, we can stay alive in the work. But the problem comes when we believe that what we're doing is unethical. If what we're doing is ethical, even though the work is heartbreaking and we have broken hearts, we can continue to do this work. I have huge respect for community workers who stay in this work with broken hearts, But if we believe that what we're doing is unethical, then I think that the thing that's got us is actually ethical pain, or a spiritual pain. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. I was supervising a worker at one of the first shelters that we had in Vancouver, and there was a lot of NIMBYism, not in my backyard, a lot of surveillance, a lot of hate coming from people around wanting to get it closed down. At night, a young 14-year-old woman came to the shelter to come inside. It's an adult shelter, and we can't take young people in there. And this young man, he was in his 20s, and he's a worker. He had to refuse shelter to this 14-year-old woman in the middle of the night. And she said to him, "Are you telling me that I would be safer sleeping on the street than coming in here?" And he said, "What I'm telling you is you can't come into the shelter." And that landed on him personally, right? That's what I mean about, that's an unethical thing that he has to do. So that should be a problem of this society, not housing people. You know, what is a 14-year-old young woman doing on the street? Where's the social context? How's that play into that? And somehow that lands on that individual worker, as if, you know, if he did more self-care or more yoga, he would be okay with that. You can't be okay with that because it's socially unjust, right? Sometimes when we do ethical work, part of our suffering is the fact that it is heartbreaking. You know, and if you're not moved and heartbroken, then we have a different kind of an ethical problem, right? But that, if you believe that what you're doing is unethical, what lands on you is this kind of an ethical pain or a spiritual pain that has you saying, I can't stay in this work because I'm participating in something that's absolutely wrong, something that's unjust. For me, you know, I've been doing supervision for 3 decades now, and you know, with survivors of torture, rape crisis centers, all kinds of different work. And no one tells me it's about the pain of clients is too much for me to handle. Everybody talks about, you know, we're in a society that has not delivered on social justice. And where that ends is not, you know, with the citizens and with the government. It ends on the shoulders of that individual worker telling a young woman who's vulnerable and unsafe she needs to go out and be on the street, right? And we can talk about that in terms of burnout on the worker, but that's not very client-centered. The person who's at most at risk, if we track, ethics is about tracking vulnerability. And if we track vulnerability in that situation, the person that's most vulnerable is that young woman. And that's where our concern has to land. So I think self-care is really important. I don't mean to denigrate self-care as not being important, but say that worker goes to talk to his manager or someone else about that situation. You know, it's really common that you know, that he would be with kind of a righteous anger and, you know, really frustrated, and he might have some emotion in his voice, you know, and under misogyny, feminine ways of being aren't very welcome in any gender. So, you know, but you could see his manager or someone asking, now listen, you know, like calm down. You know, I know that you work out, have you been swimming? Like, have you gone to yoga? You know, is that caffeine in your coffee? Maybe you should think. So you know, that kind of spiritual pain or ethical pain, because we're in structures that don't deliver justice, all of a sudden we're interrogating the self-care practices of a worker. All the yoga in the world ought not to make him okay with a young woman being vulnerable on the street in a rape culture, right? But I do think self-care is important, but what it's important for is to be able to keep the client at the center. So what I'm offering is a very client-centered perspective on looking at say self-care or looking at burnout. So if we see this as regulation of folks' affect or their containment or their just ability to stay within their body, be the person doing their own decision making. If this is 10 and this is 0, here's the staff worker and here's the client. You know, 10 is where someone is going to be put in a place where other people are making all their decisions for them, where we're worried that they're going to commit harm to themselves or to others. So that's about a 10, and 0 is blissed out, okay? The folks that we're working with in this epidemic, you know what? They're living at 7, 8, 9. They're up there, okay? No matter, you know, a lot of us came to this work because we had different kinds of lives. So one thing to think about is, where did you grow up? But then where do you live now? So I work super hard to try to live at about a 5 out of 10 in terms of, you know, my ability to be the person calling the shots with my body, my affect, my ways of being, my thinking. And, you know, what self-care is for is I want to come into work at about a 3. You can't come into work at 5 and then start to cool down. It's an ethical obligation to do enough self-care so that you can actually come into the work at about a 3. This is what self-care is for. Self-care is the difference between where I live and where I need to be at work. And then when I come to work, you know, and I'm meeting this person where they're at in the world, you know, it may be that they're just asking me for a bus ticket. But that bus ticket, and of course, my answer is going to be no, I don't have any bus tickets for anybody as a shelter worker, right? But that's not just a bus ticket. What that person's thinking about is they can't make their meeting with their parole officer, they're going to get breached, they're going to be in jail. Jail is always organized around violence and racism. Horrid things happen there. So, you know, there's all kinds of massive real world consequences for this person. So, we can easily judge it from outside and say this is an out of kilter response that they're having, but actually it's about where their lives are at. So this person's going up in terms of their distress, right? And so our job is to come from self-care, to get ourselves down to 3 so that we can meet people where they are at in the world and bring us both down. Because the reality is we don't self-regulate, we co-regulate, okay? And so that's what self-care is for. It's really important, but it's also client-centered. It's in the best interest of our clients for us to do enough self-care to be able to be really present for them and have them be at the center of our care. So that's kind of generally what I think about in terms of resisting burnout and looking at self-care from a client-centered perspective.
So I hope that you found that as illuminating as I did in terms of what self-care is for and what the limitations of self-care are, right? So self-care is limited for all of the reasons that Vikki laid out. It's not enough in and of itself to keep us well in the work, but it's absolutely essential if we want to be truly client-centered, right? As for all, in all the ways she talked about. If we're person-centered, we have to do self-care, right? That is the practice. So here's my question for you, and we don't have time to answer it now, but where did you grow up, right? Vikki said she was about a 5, right, on that scale from 0 to 10. And where do you live now in terms of that scale? And how do you come into work at around a 3, as she was talking about, using self-care so that the client gets to be the person at the center? And so again, this is really about sustainability. Again, as Vikki said, that people don't come into this work just to not burn out, right? We want so much more than that, right? That ongoing aliveness, that connectedness with people, that spirited presence where you've actually got something to give, right? You've done enough self-care to where you can meet with them and be with them in that place of connection, right? And everybody in this Zoom room at this conference, right? You are all such an amazing community of people. And we want to be of use across our whole lifespan, right? In all of our paid and unpaid work, right? You're the people who your friends and families also call on, right? Like we're not just doing our work, we're also, there for our communities, our friends and family. We're holding a lot up. And so that's what I mean about sustainability. It's being able to do that across the lifespan, and that's what I think is really what's going to keep us alive in this work, is talking our talk, right? And really being in that place of living ethics. Right. And so this is something that Vikki invites folks to do with teams, is to really think about what are your collective ethics within your teams? Like some of the stuff we talked about, what drew you to this work? What do you hold? What do you value most? Hold close, maybe even hold sacred in this work, right? Maybe being able to be transparent and honest and do dignity with people, as we talked about. And what ethics are required for your work without which you'd be unable to work? Right? If you're in a position of needing to be dishonest with people as part of company policy, those are the kinds of things that can burn folks out, right? Very easily, and kind of put them into that place of spiritual pain, or something like, the example that Vikki used, having to deny shelter to a young person in the middle of the night, right? That lands on individual workers, that spiritual and ethical pain. So I want to take you into the next phase of this framework. So once we've kind of laid out what self-care is, what it isn't, what it's for, we're going to look at the zone of fabulousness, which Vikki talks about as a term that she borrowed from queer culture, which is really a way of kind of looking at how people burn out in this work and what is required to prevent and resist burnout.
Hi, I'm Vikki Reynolds. I'm an adjunct professor and a clinical supervisor, but mostly I'm a social justice activist, and my work is really trying to keep people who are working in the margins well and ethical so that we can be of use across time. So the idea of the zone of fabulousness, it's an alternative way to look at worker burnout. Instead of measuring the mental wellness of the worker, I'm interested in trying to center the person we're trying to serve, the person that gets called a client. So what I want to know is, are we holding ourselves close to our clients, or are we moving away? So what I think about is sometimes Workers do get harmed in the work. I'm not denying that. But it usually falls out one of two ways. One way that people kind of enact burnout is by moving way too close to clients. And this is where we start to create relationships that are way too intimate with clients, to the fact that they're actually transgressive. And when we're with enmeshment and we move too close to clients, sometimes workers situate themselves as heroes. I always remind myself a hero is someone whose one parent is a god and one parent's a human. So it's a pretty undoable position. But these are folks who, they work hard and then they keep just working harder. It's kind of like they're shoveling water. They feel really ineffective, so they just keep working. But they move so close into clients that they lose track of all kinds of boundaries. And they work like lone wolves. These are folks who say things like, I had to take a client home because I'm the only person they've got. As soon as you start to think you're the only person they've got. They also really diminish the work of other workers, and they only take on the work that feeds them. Like you clean the toilets and you start doing the session notes because I'm going to talk to people because I'm really relational. They really like me. So when folks get enmeshed, they move way too close to people, and those relationships can be really intrusive. If we think about trauma symptoms, they can be intruding and crossing the boundaries of people, and it's really not attainable. Like they can't keep going on like that. And so they become really ineffective, and they're the folks who, when they cross these boundaries, they can get organizations investigated and shut down. These are folks who sometimes lose their job because it's so obvious they've gone way beyond the pale, but really diminishing the work of other workers. And but the transgressions of intimacy make it very unsafe for clients, and they replicate things like sexual abuse, which is this real transgression of boundaries. With enmeshment, people are bleeding all over everybody. In disconnection, people don't have broken hearts because they don't bring their heart to work. People become very disconnected. So they move way too far away from the people we're trying to serve, from the people who are called clients, and they get really disconnected from their own bodies, their own spirituality, their own community, other people. These are folks who use things like avoidance and numbing if we think about trauma symptoms. So these are folks who go home from work and have to have a couple of drinks to disconnect from what happened from the day. They don't stay with it. They don't work through it. They're disconnected. People who are taken with disconnection are often taken with ineffectiveness. They're not sure what they're doing is okay. They can get taken with massive negativity, and that negativity across time turns into cynicism. They're pissed about their organization. They're pissed about their coworkers, their managers. And when these folks keep up with that massive negativity and cynicism, what they're really doing is bullying. And these are folks, when someone brings a new idea, they got to nail that right into the ground. They're like, absolutely not. This new idea you have, we've already had it. We've already tried it. It's not going to work. This place isn't going to get fixed. And they use this negativity to keep everybody away, because what they don't want to show is their work or themselves, because they're so disconnected from all of that, right? When folks are taken with disconnection, they can even move. They are so about themselves that they can get to the place where they actually situate themselves as the victims of this work. So while we're in an opiate epidemic and people are dying, you can have some staff members talk about it's hardest on them. It just seems like an absolute inversion of power, but people kind of manage when they get with that much negativity and that much disconnection to start to see themselves as a victim of their work. So where we want to be is in the middle. We want to be in the zone of fabulousness. We're in solidarity with other workers. We're not being heroes, and we're not being the victims of our work. The place where the client is actually at the center. We're really connected to our collective ethics for justice doing with people. We're in the team. We're holding each other up. That solidarity that we have with each other means we are able to offer each other critique. And we're not looking at self-care so much. We're looking for our collective care. And collective care often looks like critique. We're going to keep each other with fabulousness, so that when someone starts to slip out, we're going to kind of bring them back to those collective ethics that we serve, and that person's the thing at the center. So, when we're in the zone of fabulousness, we're in there together. You cannot keep yourself fabulous. That's really important. Everybody has great intentions. I always remind myself, nobody came to this work to hurt anybody. So if somebody's slipping towards enmeshment or disconnection, it's not where they want to be going. So my solidarity requires that I don't make them feel better about that, and I don't ignore that. I let them know about that. So we owe each other a terrible loyalty, right? And so when I see somebody leaving the zone of fabulousness, I need to offer them a critique, and I have to bring them back to what's fabulous. To do that, we have to have pre-existing relationships of respect and dignity. I don't care if coworkers like each other. In fact, sometimes it's not even helpful, because we smooth over differences between us and we don't prioritize the service we're doing to the people we're there to serve. So Yeah, I want someone who's going to have the moral courage to invite me back to accountability to our collective ethics. That's what solidarity means in this moment, in terms of the zone of fabulousness.
So I hope that you find that framework useful, that maybe you can situate yourself somewhere along that continuum, right? Or other experiences that you've had on the job. I think that there's so much there in terms of this idea of moving beyond self-care to a much more of a collective approach, right? And she talks about zone slippage, right? And that's what burnout is also like. Sometimes we don't even recognize that we're burned out until we're so deep in it, right? That's one of the ways that burnout manifests. So one of the inquiries that she really encourages individuals and teams to talk about together, right? To have these shared understandings, right? Where are you with zone slippage, right? What are the things that you think or feel or say or do that let you know that you're slipping out of the fabulous, right? Maybe you find yourself someone says, I'm sure many of you have had the experience where someone has told you, you saved my life, right? Knowing that there's a whole group around this person, there's the efforts of the person themselves. But if you start to think, oh yeah, maybe I did save this person's life, right? That's kind of veering over into the hero territory, right? That enmeshment on one side. And then on the other side, maybe you're taken with a lot of impatience. Like when folks are talking to you, it's like, what are the bullets on this thing? Just get to the point, right? And that's kind of veering over towards disconnection, right? So getting a sense of like, what are the things you think, feel, say, and do that let you know that you're moving outside of the zone? And how can you catch this, right? And respond differently? I think that's so much of what this is about. And so what we're really moving towards here is collective accountability, right? That's about really solidarity, that we are united as a team in our collective ethics. We know what's at the center of this work. And to be truly client-centered, we are required to create these relationships with coworkers that allow for a culture, if you don't like the term critique, feedback, respectful feedback. And we need to create intentional relationships of respect and dignity. That really, this is about requiring us to speak to each other about the heart of our work and the collective ethics that sustain us within the work. And we also need to be able to tell the difference between critique and criticism and attack, right? Those are very different things, right? And one of the things Vikki always talks about is that, a lot of this critique can be, in private, one-on-one. Doesn't need to be in front of the whole group, but it needs to be direct and as soon as possible, right? To kind of help bring each other back to that zone of fabulousness. And so our commitment really to keeping clients at the center means that we have to have the moral courage to speak out when we see ourselves or when we see others slipping out of that zone of fabulousness, right? And so the last thing I want to talk about, and I want to leave some time for questions or reflections, is what does that collective care look like? We're not talking about this just on a theoretical level. So there's the work that we do within our teams. And then there's the teams that we need for ourselves, right? And those are called solidarity teams. That's what Vikki calls them, right? So your solidarity team may include the people that you work with. Ideally, it's also people who are outside of work. And they are the folks that are helping to keep you fabulous as well. And you're checking in with your solidarity team on a regular basis, right? This is work that is done for you, for your sustainability, and to really be part of a collective care environment, right, where you work. And to think about, who do I want on my solidarity team, right? What are the qualities of these people? What makes them useful, right? They're not going to be folks who are going to swoop in and try to fix you or tell you to leave the work, right? But thinking about who are people you may know from activism, from faith communities, from recovery communities, folks who can really help to support you in this work. And then Vikki also talks about needing to have a howl at the moon person, right? And this is someone that, you can call when you are just at your wit's end, you've just had your worst day at work, right? And you have these conversations ahead of time with this person, right? if I call you, I need you to answer. Like, can we have an agreement about that? Right. For me, I mean, it's harder in this pandemic, but I like to actually be with people, be with my Howl at the Moon person, but that's not always possible. Right. But talking on the phone, whatever it is, that person is not there to cool you out or self-regulate you or get you to breathe or calm down, just to let them know your job is purely to hold space for me. You are that hopefully middle of the night person or someone who can at least get back to me in a reasonable time frame. So I can have a place just to be held, right? That's so important. We can't get all of our support on the job. We need to create solidarity teams for ourselves to keep our work sustainable across time. So this is a workbook. Again, I left a link in the chat and I'll drop it in again before the end of this. But, these are questions that you can really take time to answer for yourself, right? What are the things that shoulder you up in the work and that sustain you, whether that's people, music, places, rituals, and then thinking about really putting into who would you like to be on your solidarity team? How can they be useful to you? Who's that Howl at the Moon person for you, or people who will not tell you to leave the work, right? That's all really, really critical, is to kind of think about if you don't have a solidarity team already for yourself, it's really, really critical to try to pull one together. So these are just some of the tools. There's so much more that I could say, but I really hope that this framework has kind of helped you to see and understand burnout in a new way, to understand what self-care is, what it isn't. And I just want to invite you to some closing reflections that you are welcome to share in the chat, to think about what is something useful that you learned or relearned or unlearned today. What is a call for action to you? So maybe you want to take this framework back to your teams, right? That's very possible to do. All of the videos I showed, the workbook, as I said, is online, and that's all available for free for you to use to try to create more of a prevention strategy in terms of burnout at your agency. And again, like, all of this is really about being truly person-centered, right? And how do we do that? By creating collective care as well as self-care. So, and I just want to add one final quote here. This is a beautiful quote by G.K. Chesterton that I think really kind of sums up all of these ideas, is that we are all on a rickety boat on a stormy sea, and we owe each other a terrible loyalty. So I want to thank you all so much and appreciate your attention.